Sarah's at the podium there, just to let you know that we have questions afterwards as well. We want to hear your points of view.
So thanks so much for having us here tonight. For those of you who don't know PEN's work, PEN has been defending free expression and promoting literature around the world since 1921. So for 100 years, it's an organisation that's been at the forefront of the fight against censorship. And it's really quite interesting looking at that 100-year history of how censorship has changed and morphed. And what's perhaps even more interesting is that while the context has changed enormously, and particularly with the advent of the internet and the free exchange of information, one would think that we're at a position now of much wider free speech and free expression and much lower censorship. What we find particularly interesting about this moment is that we're actually in a position of threat to free expression in a way that we haven't quite seen before. And speaking in December of 2014, so a month before Charlie Hebdo, Salman Rushdie, himself no stranger to intimidation and to censorship, said, "Never before has free expression been under such threat. Never before have journalists been in such danger. And never before has censorship been so present and not present at the same time." And I thought maybe tonight what would be interesting from a global perspective in looking at surveillance, censorship and free expression is to try and kind of think about this really central paradox that we're facing, that here we are, 2015, a moment that's characterized by the information society, and yet at this moment, in an age defined by unlimited free expression and unlimited information, those who bring that information to us, journalists, have never been under such threat. They've never been targeted, murdered, imprisoned in such record numbers as they are today. And the other paradox of why, at a time when technology is supposed to make censorship impossible, is it actually on the rise? So, it can be quite difficult to understand, I think, being here in Ireland, the situation globally of free speech. And for many years, organisations like PEN and previously in the United Nations, trying to make it clear to people the sort of threat and danger that journalists are in around the world, that ultimate form of censorship, the murder of journalists. And so the start of this year being characterised by the massacre of 12 cartoonists in Paris was really quite critical in enabling people to understand what's happening, because what was interesting in the immediate sort of hours after the attack, 4 of whom were PEN members who were killed, we heard continuously on the news that this is the greatest massacre of journalists that's ever happened. And I think what was so painful about that moment was, in fact, that's completely untrue. 5 years earlier, 36 media workers have been massacred in the Philippines. Not one single person's ever been tried or brought to justice for that murder. And what's interesting is over the last decade, 700 journalists have been killed, with an impunity rate of 94% around the world. So I thought I'd kind of begin by looking at this situation of journalists and the murder of journalists as the ultimate form of censorship, and then maybe move on to talk about surveillance and mass surveillance as this great current threat to free expression, and then maybe to look at the current situation globally of the legal challenges that are preventing free expression and censorship. As you maybe remember, 2015 began with the massacre of Charlie Hebdo and the beheadings of US and Japanese journalists by ISIS. So we were in this particularly frightening moment for free speech. You may remember the Sunday following the massacre in Charlie Hebdo, more than 40 world leaders marched in Paris in a show of solidarity for free expression. And I think while that was a great, stunning display of solidarity, it was also one of the most cynical acts, because we had 40 leaders from around the world, including leaders from countries notorious for authoring the murder of journalists, the blanket takedown of content from the internet. Marching along was the representative from Turkey, where over 20 journalists are currently in prison, who used to be characterised by having the greatest number of journalists in prison in the world. At one point, during the height of the Kurdish conflict, the Turkish jails were packed with 900 journalists in prison. They were determined to lock up anyone who was criticising the regime. We also had those marching was Russia, whereas, you know, a large number of journalists have been murdered with total impunity over the last 10 years. Many, we believe, under with the direct knowledge and authorship of Putin himself. We also had Egypt, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And so it was this kind of very bizarre moment where you had both democratic leaders and non-democratic leaders in a public display of great support for free expression and against censorship, and in support of Charlie Hebdo. And yet at the very same time, it was, you know, very obvious that these are world leaders who do not take their commitments to free expression or to countering censorship seriously in any regard. So looking at the current state of journalists' safety in the world, as I mentioned, we've had the deaths of 700 journalists, and the last 2 years have been the highest years of deaths for journalists. And when we think about that, we probably think, okay, it's conflict, it's Syria, it's Iraq, and it is. Those are large numbers coming out, but actually, the vast majority of journalists who are murdered around the world at the moment are local journalists in places like Honduras, in Russia, in Turkey, in Vietnam, in China. And at PEN we have centres all over the world, and so we've lost such a huge number of our colleagues over the last 10 years, and yet governments are particularly loath to prosecute those responsible for the deaths. Last week I was in Geneva with the head of our centre from Honduras, who's called Dina Meza, and she is just one of the most extraordinary journalists you can imagine. She writes on corruption and human rights abuses in post-coup Honduras, and she's survived 3 assassination attempts, and last week she spoke to the United Nations about the situation of censorship and surveillance and journalist freedom and safety in Honduras. And unfortunately, Honduras is actually quite emblematic of the situation of journalists who are the canaries, the so-called canaries in the coal mine of democracy and safety and human rights in any given society, because they're the people who are immediately targeted for raising their heads above the parapet, for criticising governments, and that's exactly what journalists in Honduras, a country that is besieged by violence and the drug trafficking from Colombia up to North America, and yet you have a situation where actually in most cases the government is not only aware but is actively supporting the ultimate censorship of these individuals in their murder. So that's something that's seen a massive rise over the last 10 years, and in particular in the last 2 years, and already in 2015 we've had the murder of 20 journalists. So this is a huge concern. And while those deaths are taking place largely in conflict and non-democratic countries, the other huge threat that we've seen over the last few years has been that of mass surveillance. The NSA revelations brought to us by Edward Snowden in June 2013 were they were just an extraordinary indictment of the level invasion of privacy that's happening all over the world. So carried out by the US government with the full support of the other members of the Five Eyes coalition. So that's the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. So if you think of it, it's 5 of the most democratic countries in the world who are investing and actively carrying out bulk collection of all of our emails, your emails and mine. And while we don't think perhaps that it's particularly problematic if they're surveilling, the emails of hard-working people in Ireland, it is particularly problematic because we have no idea what happens to that data, how it's stored, or how it will be used in the future. Now, PEN has, following the revelations by Snowden, we've carried out a number of research projects to try and understand what is the impact, the censoring impact of surveillance on writers and journalists around the world. And what we found, if you're interested, it's a report called Chilling Effects. We carried out a large-scale research project with writers and journalists around the world, and found that at this point in January 2015, writers in democratic countries are now censoring themselves at the same level as writers in non-democratic countries. So the fear of surveillance of writers is so high that level of self-censorship, which in a way is really the worst form of censorship, because it's where we actively stop expressing ourselves, actively stop expressing opinions that are hostile to power, and that now is at a par. So it's an extraordinary moment for free expression, and it's left a lot of us in the human rights community a bit bemused about where do you turn to. I was at the UN when the Snowden revelations took place, and the historic champions of free speech, who we would have always gone to advocate on behalf of journalists in repressive regimes, they've disappeared. I mean, it was so excruciating to watch the United States try and defend itself and at the same time criticize China's surveillance at a moment where Edward Snowden had just revealed that they're actually taking larger amounts of bulk collection of data. And so I think, we see a very quickly shifting landscape for free expression and for censorship at this moment. And we also see, Charlie Hebdo has become such a central moment because it also brings together this tension between free expression and freedom of religion, between the issues that William has raised. How do you accommodate such varying understandings of what it is to live in a civilized society? And so as we look at how do you move forward on issues of censorship, we found it particularly helpful to reach out to writers and to get their understandings of where we are, both in terms of surveillance and in terms of the global situation of free expression. And so two of the quotes that have really stuck with me, and maybe we can talk about this more in the questions. One which I found really amazing was from the late Christopher Hitchens, who was, we were talking about, as we were asking writers about the best ways to deal with questions of censorship. Somebody brought up Hitchens' great quote of him quoting Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons, and he says, "Bear in mind that every time you violate or propose to violate the free speech of others, you are making a rod for your own back. Who's going to decide which speech is harmful or who is the harmful speaker? To whom would you give this job? To award the job of censor?" And as we work towards an understanding post-Charlie Hebdo of how we can bring, I suppose, free speech and and tolerance into a coexistence. We also found the quote from Ian McEwan particularly helpful. I think I'll end it here. That the freedom that allows the editors of Charlie Hebdo their satire is exactly the same freedom that allows Muslims in France to worship and express their views openly. The divide cannot have it both ways. Free speech is hard, it's noisy, and bruising sometimes, but the only alternative when worldviews must cohabit is intimidation, violence, and bitter conflict between communities.